Palestinian genocide, a systematic erasure of a people under the eyes of the world. The Gaza genocide represents one of the gravest humanitarian and legal crises of the 21st century, the ongoing, intentional, and systematic destruction of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, carried out by Israel under the guise of the so-called Gaza War. The acts constituting this genocide are neither isolated nor accidental. They form a deliberate pattern of extermination encompassing mass killings, starvation, the infliction of severe bodily and psychological harm, and the prevention of births within the besieged population. This machinery of destruction extends beyond the battlefield, manifesting in the blockade of life-sustaining resources, the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, the annihilation of healthcare facilities, the killing of medical personnel and aid workers, and the terrorization of a population through forced displacement and sexual violence. The destruction of educational, religious, and cultural sites completes the systematic attempt to erase the very identity and continuity of Palestinian existence in Gaza. These acts have not gone unnoticed by the international community. The genocide has been recognized by a United Nations Special Committee and Commission of Inquiry, the International Association of Genocide Scholars, numerous human rights organizations, and a growing consensus among international law and genocide studies experts. The evidence is overwhelming, and the implications are damning. By October 2025, the Gaza Health Ministry reported that at least 66,148 Palestinians had been killed, the vast majority civilians, half of whom are women and children. Thousands more remain buried beneath the rubble of bombed neighborhoods, their bodies unrecovered and uncounted. According to The Lancet, deaths from traumatic injuries were already underreported by mid-2024, and when indirect deaths caused by starvation, disease, and lack of medical care are considered, the true toll could exceed 93,000, nearly 5% of Gaza's pre-war population. Over 160,000 people have been injured, and Gaza now holds the tragic record of having the highest number of child amputees per capita in the world. More than 21,000 children have been permanently disabled, their futures stolen before they could even begin. The Israeli blockade, long condemned by international observers, has weaponized hunger. It has imposed conditions of famine upon an entire population. By August 2025, projections indicated that 100% of Gaza's inhabitants were suffering from high levels of acute food insecurity, with over 641,000 people facing catastrophic levels of starvation. The systematic deprivation of food, water, electricity, and medical supplies forms a clear and deliberate assault on the civilian population, designed not merely to punish but to annihilate. The destruction of healthcare and education has deepened the humanitarian abyss. As of May 2024, 84% of Gaza's health facilities had been destroyed or severely damaged. Israel's bombing campaign wiped out all 12 universities in Gaza and destroyed 80% of its schools, a direct strike against the intellectual and cultural lifeblood of a nation. Over 1.9 million Palestinians, or 85% of the population, have been forcibly displaced, a staggering act of collective punishment unprecedented in modern times. In response, the government of South Africa brought a case before the International Court of Justice, ICJ, South Africa versus Israel, accusing Israel of violating the Genocide Convention. In its initial ruling, the ICJ affirmed South Africa's right to bring the case and recognized that Palestinians in Gaza have a legal right to protection from genocide. The court ordered Israel to take immediate measures to prevent genocidal acts, to halt incitement, and to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza. Subsequent orders called for an increase in humanitarian assistance and a halt to the Rafah offensive. Israel, however, has defied these rulings, continuing its military campaign and siege with impunity. Today, an increasing body of legal scholars, human rights experts, and genocide researchers agree, what is unfolding in Gaza is not simply a war, it is a genocide. It is a state-led, systematic campaign of extermination carried out against a captive population, under the watch of a world too divided, too complicit, or too indifferent to stop it. The name Gaza has thus become more than a place, it has become a symbol of humanity's moral collapse, a mirror reflecting the hypocrisy of international law, and a call to conscience for all those who still believe that justice must mean something in our time. The origins and escalation of the Gaza genocide, from the Nakba to the present war. There is an ongoing debate among scholars, historians, and international law experts over when the Gaza genocide truly began. While some frame it as a response to the events following October 7, 2023, others contend that it represents only the latest and most violent phase of a slow-motion genocide, a systematic process of ethnic cleansing and dispossession that began with the Nakba of 1948, when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled from their homes upon the founding of the State of Israel. According to scholars, the human rights organization B'Tselem, and a growing body of academic research, the genocide in Gaza must be understood within the broader context of over 75 years of Zionist settler-colonial violence and Jewish supremacy targeting the Palestinian people. Since 2007, the Gaza Strip has been governed by Hamas, an Islamist political and militant organization, while the West Bank remained under the administrative control of the Palestinian Authority. Following Hamas takeover, Israel imposed a total land, air, and sea blockade on Gaza, justifying it on security grounds. Yet international human rights groups, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have long condemned the blockade as a form of collective punishment, a war crime under international law. The blockade has crippled Gaza's economy and infrastructure, creating a humanitarian catastrophe. According to UNRWA, by 2023, 81% of Gazans lived below the poverty line, and 63% were food insecure, heavily dependent on international aid merely to survive. Over the past 2 decades, the Gaza Strip has endured for major wars, in 2008 to 2009, 2012, 2014, and 2021, alongside countless smaller military operations that left tens of thousands dead and much of the enclave reduced to rubble. Each assault deepened the humanitarian crisis, intensified Israel's control, and tested the limits of international law's ability to prevent crimes against humanity. The events of October 7, 2023, marked a new and devastating turning point. On that day, Hamas and other Palestinian militant groups launched a coordinated attack from Gaza into southern Israel, killing over 1,100 people, most of them civilians, and abducting 251 hostages. Israel's response was immediate, overwhelming, and indiscriminate, a massive bombing campaign that began within hours and quickly escalated into a full-scale ground invasion on October 27, 2023. Within the first 48 hours, Israeli Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi declared that the army had struck 1,000 targets, telling his wife that Gaza will be destroyed. Soon after, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly demanded that 5,000 targets be hit, even though the Israeli military had not identified that many enemy sites. Artificial intelligence systems were used to auto-generate bombing targets, often relying on outdated or unverified intelligence, resulting in catastrophic civilian losses. Within a month, over 10,000 Palestinians had been killed, including entire families erased from the population registry, a rate of killing that scholar Shmuel Lederman described as criminal as it gets. While some observers argue that Israel's campaign began as a legitimate act of war and only later evolved into genocide, others insist that the genocidal intent was present from the very outset. For B'Tselem, the October 7th attack served as a triggering event that shifted Israeli policy from oppression and control to destruction and annihilation. On October 13, 2023, Israeli historian Raz Siegel publicly described Israel's actions as a textbook case of genocide, one of the earliest and most prominent voices to do so. His assessment was later echoed by numerous scholars, legal experts, and human rights organizations who found that Israel's rhetoric, military conduct, and policies collectively met the legal threshold for genocide under the Genocide Convention. The UN Special Committee to investigate Israeli practices affecting the human rights of the Palestinian people reinforced this conclusion in its September 2024 report, stating that Israel's policies and practices during the reporting period are consistent with the characteristics of genocide. This determination followed mounting evidence: the systematic bombing of hospitals, schools, and refugee camps, the deliberate obstruction of humanitarian aid, and official statements from Israeli leaders invoking dehumanizing language and calls for Gaza's destruction. Hamas officials, for their part, claimed that their October 7 operation was a reaction to decades of Israeli occupation, the blockade of Gaza, escalating settler violence in the West Bank, severe movement restrictions imposed on Palestinians, and the mass detention of thousands, many held without charge. Regardless of the justifications presented by either side, the events that followed have led to an unparalleled humanitarian catastrophe, and a growing global recognition that Gaza has become the site of a modern genocide. In July 2024, the International Court of Justice, ICJ, issued an advisory opinion reaffirming that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory is illegal and violates the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. This ruling added judicial weight to what countless Palestinians, activists, and human rights defenders have long asserted, that the violence in Gaza cannot be seen in isolation, but as the culmination of a 75-year project of displacement, domination, and destruction. From the Nakba of 1948 to the bombings of 2025, the arc of Palestinian suffering traces a single, unbroken line, a trajectory of systematic persecution that has transformed Gaza into the most densely bombed and besieged territory on earth. The genocide unfolding there is not a sudden eruption of violence, but the endgame of a decades-long process of dehumanization, rooted in a political ideology that has always sought, in one form or another, to erase an entire people from their land. Definitions of genocide and the legal barriers to accountability. The question of what constitutes genocide, and how it is proven in the eyes of international law, lies at the heart of the debate over Gaza and countless other atrocities of the modern era. The 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, established in the wake of the Holocaust, defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. These acts include killing members of the group, causing them serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This legal framework, though historic in its ambition to prevent another mass extermination, has since revealed deep structural weaknesses in its application and enforcement. One of the most significant of these weaknesses lies in the requirement of intent. Under the Convention, genocide is not merely about the scale of destruction but about the purpose behind it, the deliberate, conscious aim to eradicate a people. This standard of proof has proven extraordinarily difficult to meet, often allowing perpetrators to escape accountability by cloaking their actions in the language of self-defense, security, or counterterrorism. As a result, despite decades of genocidal atrocities, from Cambodia to Rwanda, from Darfur to Myanmar, the International Court of Justice, ICJ, has never once found a state legally guilty of genocide. The high threshold for establishing genocidal intent remains one of the principal barriers to justice in international law. The concept of genocide itself was first articulated by Raphael Lemkin, the Polish-Jewish jurist who coined the term in 1944. Lemkin's original conception was far broader than the legal definition that emerged in 1948. He envisioned genocide not merely as the physical annihilation of a people, but as the destruction of their social, cultural, and political existence, what he called the disintegration of the foundations of national groups. Lemkin saw genocide as encompassing cultural erasure, linguistic suppression, the dismantling of educational systems, and the destruction of spiritual life, forms of violence that kill not only bodies but civilizations. Over time, however, this broad vision was narrowed by political compromise. The Genocide Convention, shaped by post-war power dynamics, excluded cultural and political groups from its protection and confined genocide to physical or biological destruction. This restrictive interpretation has since dominated the practice of international law, forcing courts to focus narrowly on measurable acts of killing rather than the systemic dismantling of a people's identity and continuity. Scholarly debate continues to divide the field. While orthodox interpretations of genocide emphasize direct acts of physical destruction, revisionist scholars argue for a return to Lemkin's holistic framework, recognizing that the annihilation of a culture can be as devastating and final as the extermination of its population. The erasure of language, the demolition of sacred sites, and the obliteration of education and healthcare systems, such as those witnessed in Gaza, constitute, in this broader sense, the destruction of a people's means to exist. Importantly, international jurisprudence does not require a minimum number of victims for an act to qualify as genocide. The crime is defined not by scale alone but by intention and targeting. Even the killing of a relatively small portion of a population may fulfill the criteria if it reflects a systematic intent to destroy the group, in whole or in part. This principle underscores that genocide can occur through attrition, starvation, forced displacement, or sterilization, forms of extermination that unfold quietly, often without the spectacle of mass death but with the same devastating result. In the Rohingya genocide case before the ICJ, several states urged the court to adopt what they called a balanced approach, one that recognizes the special gravity of the crime of genocide without setting the bar for proof so impossibly high that accountability becomes unattainable. This position reflects growing frustration among legal scholars and human rights advocates who see the current threshold for proving genocidal intent as a shield for powerful states, rather than a safeguard for victims. The legal and moral challenge, then, is to bridge the gap between what genocide looks like in reality and what the law is willing to acknowledge. When entire societies are starved, displaced, or bombed into non-existence under official doctrines of self-defense, the international community must confront the question: how many more legal definitions must we refine before we dare to call a genocide by its name? Genocidal intent and incitement, the language and logic of extermination. One of the clearest indicators of genocidal policy is not only what a state does, but what its leaders say while doing it. In the case of Gaza, the public declarations of Israeli political and military officials, coupled with the state's systematic actions, have drawn international condemnation and a growing scholarly consensus that the war on Gaza is being conducted with genocidal intent. On the 9th of October 2023, just 2 days after the Hamas-led attack on Israel, Yoav Gallant, Israel's Minister of Defense, announced, "I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel, everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we are acting accordingly." This statement, made as Israel began its bombardment of Gaza, was not an isolated outburst. It was part of a broader pattern of dehumanizing rhetoric, echoed by senior Israeli leaders and media figures, that framed the Palestinian population as subhuman, expendable, and collectively responsible. Such language, historically recognized as a hallmark of genocidal campaigns, transformed Gaza's 2 million inhabitants into targets rather than civilians. According to genocide scholars and human rights experts, these verbal declarations, combined with Israel's military conduct, leave little ambiguity regarding intent. The United Nations Commission of Inquiry, Amnesty International, Genocide Watch, and numerous independent scholars have identified a pattern of conduct in Israel's operations and rhetoric for which, as the UN inquiry put it, genocidal intent is the only reasonable inference. The evidence cited is extensive. Israeli officials, commentators, and military figures have repeatedly issued statements that glorify destruction, call for mass expulsions, and celebrate civilian suffering. These include appeals to erase Gaza, to turn it into a parking lot, and to wipe out every last Hamas member, often without distinction between combatants and civilians. Prominent journalists and politicians have likewise described Palestinians as human beasts and children of darkness, reinforcing a narrative of racialized dehumanization. The genocidal intent is further demonstrated by the systematic and disproportionate nature of Israel's military actions, which far exceed any plausible military necessity. Among the most disturbing features of the campaign are the deliberate and repeated targeting of children and families, the documented use of starvation and deprivation as a weapon of war, the destruction of hospitals, schools, and cultural landmarks, the widespread sexual violence reported by international monitors, and the creation of conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction, including the mass displacement of nearly the entire population. These acts have continued despite full awareness of their catastrophic humanitarian consequences, further reinforcing the legal inference of genocidal intent. As historian Barry Trachtenberg testified in the case Defense for Children International, Palestine et al. v. Biden et al., the cumulative effect of Israeli officials' rhetoric and the pattern of military conduct underlies the consensus among genocide historians that the situation in Gaza constitutes genocide. The UN Commission of Inquiry has gone even further, naming high-ranking Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, President Isaac Herzog, and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, as responsible for direct and public incitement to commit genocide. Such charges are unprecedented against the leadership of a state claiming democratic legitimacy and underscore the gravity of the international findings. Potential motives, ideology, retaliation, and supremacy. Understanding the motive behind genocidal violence requires examining the ideological roots of the state committing it. Many scholars argue that the Gaza genocide is not an isolated eruption of brutality but rather the culmination of a settler-colonial project stretching back to the Nakba of 1948, when Zionist militias displaced and killed Palestinians to establish the State of Israel. From this perspective, the destruction of Gaza represents a continuation, indeed, an intensification, of a decades-long effort to remove Palestinians from their homeland and consolidate exclusive Jewish sovereignty over historic Palestine. While Israel's government has officially framed its actions as retaliation for the October 7 attacks, claiming its goal is to destroy Hamas, free hostages, and defend itself, the scale, scope, and rhetoric of the campaign reveal a much broader agenda. Multiple commentators and legal experts argue that Israel's war aims have gone far beyond neutralizing Hamas, amounting instead to collective retribution against the Palestinian population. Legal scholar Nimr Sultani identifies anti-Palestinianism, a pervasive ideological framework that sees Palestinian life as inherently disposable, as a central motive. Other genocide researchers, including Raz Siegel and Beat Selim, emphasize the role of settler colonialism and Jewish supremacy as structural drivers of state violence. This is echoed in the reports of Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, and historian Amos Goldberg, both of whom highlight how the war on Gaza aligns with the long-term Greater Israel project, the expansion of Israeli control through the dispossession and erasure of the Palestinian people. In this light, the genocide in Gaza is not merely a consequence of war but the logical outcome of an ideology that defines one group's survival through the systematic destruction of another. When the architects of state policy speak openly of annihilation, and when their armies carry it out under international impunity, the question ceases to be whether intent exists, but why the world continues to ignore it. Genocidal acts in Gaza. The systematic annihilation of Palestinian life in Gaza has been described by international experts as one of the most devastating and deliberate campaigns of mass killing in modern history. What began as a declared military operation has evolved into a calculated project of extermination, where the lines between combatant and civilian have been deliberately erased. The relentless bombardment, targeting patterns, and official rhetoric have converged into a portrait of state-led genocide, executed under the guise of national defense, yet defined by the wholesale destruction of an entire people. From the earliest days of the assault, Israel's military strategy has revealed an unmistakable disregard for civilian life. Within the first 2 months, over 25,000 tons of explosives were dropped on one of the most densely populated territories on Earth, much of it composed of unguided, dumb bombs that leveled entire neighborhoods. Hospitals, refugee camps, and schools were not collateral damage, they became deliberate targets. UN experts and leading human rights organizations have classified the actions as extermination, a crime against humanity characterized by mass killing on a scale and with an intent that surpasses any claim of military necessity. Eyewitness accounts, video evidence, and survivor testimonies describe a pattern of summary executions and indiscriminate killing. Unarmed civilians were shot while waving white flags. Families were buried together under the rubble of their own homes. Mass graves have been uncovered, with corpses bound at the wrists, women, men, and children, executed at close range. Doctors in Gaza have reported an alarming number of children with single, precise gunshot wounds to the head or chest, suggesting deliberate targeting. By December 2023, the number of Palestinians killed in Gaza surpassed 20,000. The majority were women and children, the defenseless, the voiceless, the ones who could not flee. By May 2024, the death toll exceeded 35,000. Thousands more remained missing beneath the debris, their bodies decomposing in silence. By October 2025, that number had more than doubled, reaching over 67,000 dead, between 3 and 4% of Gaza's total population. In proportionate terms, this scale of civilian killing places the Gaza war among the deadliest genocides of the 21st century, rivaling Rwanda, Mariupol, and Srebrenica. Reports from Israeli sources, including Plus 972 magazine and Local Call, have further exposed the chilling calculation behind these deaths. IDF intelligence officers revealed that the army had authorized the killing of up to 20 civilians for every low-ranking militant, and over 100 for senior targets. The logic was explicit: it was easier to bomb militants in their family homes. Dumb bombs, crude, devastating weapons with wide blast radii, were used to conserve expensive precision munitions. Commanders even established kill zones where soldiers were instructed to shoot anything that moved, armed or not. By 2024, international journalists and human rights monitors noted that entire Palestinian bloodlines were being wiped out, multiple generations extinguished in single airstrikes. The Associated Press described it as the destruction of family trees, not just homes. The Gaza Health Ministry confirmed that over 1,400 families had been completely erased from the civil registry. The destruction was not limited to immediate violence. By mid-2025, reports surfaced that Israeli soldiers were ordered to fire on crowds gathered around humanitarian aid sites, attacks that killed more than 1,000 people. Amnesty International concluded that such actions formed part of a broader strategy to impose starvation and deprivation as tools of genocide. Statistical analyses reinforce the horror. Studies conducted in 2024 and 2025 estimated between 70,000 and 93,000 deaths from traumatic injury alone, with 59% of victims being women, children, or the elderly. A Lancet study calculated that life expectancy in Gaza had fallen by nearly 35 years in just 12 months, a demographic collapse unmatched outside the history of genocide. Behind the numbers lie human lives, newborns pulled lifeless from rubble, medics killed beside their patients, mothers clutching the bodies of their children. This is not a war of defense, it is an assault designed to erase a population from existence. What began with airstrikes has become a slow-motion genocide, sustained by siege, starvation, and the cold arithmetic of extermination, one family, one street, one generation at a time. Indirect deaths, the silent expansion of genocide in Gaza. Beyond the relentless bombings and visible massacres lies a quieter, more insidious form of killing, one that claims lives not with bullets or airstrikes, but with hunger, thirst, and disease. These are the indirect deaths of Gaza, the slow, preventable, and systematic extinguishing of human life through deprivation. While the world's cameras capture the explosions, an even greater humanitarian collapse unfolds out of sight, in dark hospital corridors without medicine, in refugee camps without food, and in homes where parents watch their children die of malnutrition. The destruction of Gaza's civilian infrastructure has not been collateral damage, it has been a deliberate method of warfare. The blockade on electricity, water, and fuel, coupled with Israel's calculated obstruction of humanitarian aid, has rendered survival itself impossible for millions. Entire hospital networks have been dismantled. Sewage systems are destroyed. Clean water is a rarity. Mothers carry their lifeless children, victims not of shrapnel, but of starvation. The siege has transformed Gaza into a territory where life itself has been criminalized. A landmark study by Erasure Katib, Martin Key, and Salim Youssef projected that the true toll of the war would extend far beyond the battlefield. Their findings revealed that indirect Palestinian deaths, those resulting from hunger, untreated disease, and the collapse of public health systems, are expected to be 4 to 16 times higher than the number of those directly killed by violence. They estimated that as many as 186,000 or more people could die as a result of this war, even if the bombs were to stop today. The researchers warned that the combination of siege, displacement, and systematic destruction of healthcare facilities would produce a humanitarian death toll unprecedented in modern genocide. While some analysts, such as Professor Mike Spagat, questioned the precision of the methodology, even critics agreed on the underlying truth: Gaza's civilian mortality is staggeringly high, and the indirect effects of the siege are a central driver of that reality. Historian Donald Bloxham went further, arguing that labeling these deaths indirect is misleading, because the policies that cause them are not incidental, but intentional. The deliberate obstruction of food, water, medicine, and humanitarian relief, he argued, makes these deaths direct outcomes of state policy, instruments of extermination by deprivation. By October 2024, the hidden dimension of Gaza's genocide had become undeniable. A group of American healthcare workers who had served in the enclave published an open letter estimating that at least 62,000 people, mostly children, had already died of starvation, based on conservative interpretations of Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC, data. They also estimated that another 5,000 people had died for lack of access to care for chronic illnesses such as diabetes, heart disease, and cancer, treatable conditions turned into death sentences by blockade. The numbers are staggering, but the human stories behind them are unbearable. Infants born into starvation, too weak to cry. elderly patients dying alone in bombed-out hospitals, families boiling grass and animal feed to survive. Gaza's population, already under siege for over 17 years, has now been pushed past the threshold of human endurance. Two separate reviews published in The Economist drew a chilling comparison: the scale of Gaza's population loss and the collapse in life expectancy, an estimated 35-year drop, mirror the demographic devastation of the Rwandan genocide. This collapse is not the byproduct of war, it is the result of a policy, the systematic denial of life-sustaining resources as a weapon of extermination. The indirect deaths of Gaza are, in truth, no less deliberate than the direct ones. They are the calculated consequence of siege warfare, the slow killing of a people by hunger, thirst, and despair. In this war, the silence between explosions is not peace, it is the sound of genocide continuing by other means. Starvation and blockade, deliberate tools of genocide in Gaza. The Gaza Strip is not merely a war zone, it is a laboratory of deprivation, where starvation and blockade have been weaponized to systematically destroy a population. The deliberate withholding of food, water, medicine, and essential services constitutes a calculated strategy of genocide, recognized by international experts and human rights organizations as a method of annihilation alongside mass bombardment. The siege has transformed the daily act of survival into a struggle against death itself, with children and the elderly disproportionately bearing the consequences. From the earliest days of the genocide, Israel has restricted humanitarian access, violating binding orders from the International Court of Justice, ICJ, to prevent genocide. Reports from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and Refugees International documented consistent, groundless impediments to aid delivery, describing a systematic effort to starve the civilian population. B'Tselem characterized the unfolding famine as the product of a deliberate and conscious Israeli policy, while scholars and UN experts identified starvation as a method of genocidal intent, intended to destroy the Palestinian people, in whole or in part. By December 2023, over half of Gaza's population was already experiencing extreme hunger, with fewer than 1 in 10 eating daily. UN and World Food Programme assessments revealed that nearly 48% of Gazans were suffering from severe food insecurity. Palestinian officials called Israel's use of starvation a weapon of war, while Israeli authorities dismissed the accusations as delusional, despite clear evidence of targeted restrictions on aid, fuel, and water. The blockade's effects were catastrophic. Agricultural infrastructure, fishing fleets, greenhouses, and orchards were destroyed, leaving Gazans with no means to feed themselves. UN and independent experts described Gaza as a civilian population made to go hungry so quickly and completely that it defies historical precedent. Children, the most vulnerable, faced the prospect of lifelong malnutrition, while families struggled to access even the most basic necessities. Israel's obstruction of humanitarian aid persisted even after ICJ rulings mandating the facilitation of relief supplies. In early 2024, the number of aid trucks allowed into Gaza dropped by 40%, exacerbating food insecurity and increasing the risk of epidemics. Multiple Israeli human rights organizations condemned the state for failing to comply with international law, while UN special rapporteurs on the right to food and health explicitly accused Israel of using famine as a weapon of genocide, emphasizing the intentionality behind these actions. By late 2024, the general's plan intensified the crisis, ordering mass evacuations of northern Gaza and a full siege on food, water, and fuel, leaving those who remained vulnerable to arrest, killing, or starvation. The International Criminal Court subsequently issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, citing their criminal responsibility for employing starvation as a method of warfare. In 2025, Israel intermittently allowed minimal humanitarian aid into Gaza, often conditioned on political compliance or concentrated in limited southern areas. Aid distribution plans, managed by entities such as the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and backed by the United States, were criticized for forcing further displacement and failing to reach the most vulnerable. Palestinians attempting to access aid have been repeatedly targeted by Israeli forces, resulting in additional deaths. As of August 2025, the entire population of Gaza is experiencing extreme food insecurity, with approximately 641,000 individuals facing catastrophic levels of starvation. The IPC confirmed that famine is ongoing in Gaza, underscoring the lethal impact of the blockade. Through deliberate denial of sustenance and the systematic disruption of essential services, starvation in Gaza has become both a method and a mechanism of genocide, a calculated attempt to annihilate a population through the slow, excruciating deprivation of life itself. Deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure and forced displacement in Gaza. Since the onset of the 2023 genocide, Gaza has been subjected to an unprecedented campaign of systematic destruction and forced displacement, targeting not only military objectives but the very fabric of civilian life. Scholars Mark Levine and Elise Semerjian situate this mass demolition within Israel's De'iyah doctrine, describing it as herbicide and a tool of genocide. Forensic architecture confirmed in October 2024 that Israel's military operations were organized, systematic, and intended to destroy conditions of life and life-sustaining infrastructure. By mid-2025, approximately 70% of Gaza's buildings were either destroyed or severely damaged, with contractors reportedly paid per demolished structure. Human Rights Watch has documented deliberate attacks on critical infrastructure, including water and sanitation systems, power plants, solar panels, and hospitals. Repair efforts were systematically obstructed through blockades of fuel, materials, and personnel. These attacks created unlivable conditions, leading to preventable deaths, including at least 15 children who died from hypothermia in the winter months due to the destruction of housing and power facilities. Israeli officials openly acknowledged that continued destruction of homes would leave Gazans with no place to return, effectively pressuring populations to emigrate. Controlled demolitions and systematic targeting of civilian infrastructure, as reported by the BBC in July 2025, were justified by Israel on the grounds that militant groups were embedded within civilian areas. Yet these operations, conducted on a large scale with indiscriminate impact, constitute potential violations of international law, including the Geneva Conventions. Simultaneously, Israel executed an extensive program of forced displacement. Beginning in October 2023 and accelerating with the October 2024 designation of northern Gaza as a combat zone, Israel issued evacuation orders to nearly 1.9 million people, effectively the entirety of Gaza's population. The orders were often inconsistent, issued under bombardment, and offered no safe passage, resulting in mass displacement under life-threatening conditions. Humanitarian zones were repeatedly targeted, while aid was blocked, exacerbating starvation, homelessness, and the destruction of livelihoods. International organizations, including Human Rights Watch and the UN Human Rights Office, have described Israel's systematic forced displacement as war crimes and crimes against humanity. The UN noted that these policies could amount to the destruction of the Palestinian population in Gaza's northernmost governorate through death and displacement. High-ranking Israeli officials have publicly indicated that reducing Gaza's territory and expelling its population was a central objective of military operations, signaling an intent consistent with ethnic cleansing and a broader genocidal strategy. South Africa and other states have explicitly cited these evacuations as critical components of the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Through the deliberate demolition of civilian infrastructure and the systematic expulsion of nearly the entire population, Israel has imposed conditions designed to annihilate the Palestinian presence in Gaza, undermining basic human survival and reshaping the territory through enforced deprivation and displacement. Attacks on healthcare, reproductive services, and cultural heritage in Gaza. The Israeli assault on Gaza has systematically targeted the foundations of Palestinian life, including healthcare, reproductive services, education, and cultural and religious institutions, producing catastrophic effects on the civilian population and further evidencing genocidal intent. From the earliest days of the genocide in October 2023, hospitals began shutting down as fuel and medical supplies ran out, leading to preventable deaths of premature infants in neonatal intensive care units. Airstrikes have repeatedly killed medical personnel, destroyed ambulances, and demolished hospitals and clinics. Médecins Sans Frontières reported significant casualties among its staff and the destruction of facilities, while the Gaza Health Ministry declared the healthcare system totally collapsed. By April 2024, UN Special Rapporteur Tlaling Mafokeng warned that the destruction of healthcare facilities had reached unprecedented proportions. By February 2025, at least 160 healthcare workers were detained by Israel, with others missing. UN investigations in March 2025 concluded that Israel had committed genocidal acts by deliberately destroying reproductive healthcare facilities, including Gaza's primary in vitro fertilization center, Al-Basma IVF Center, resulting in the destruction of approximately 4,000 embryos and 1,000 specimens of sperm and unfertilized eggs. The Commission determined that these actions were intended to prevent births among Palestinians, representing a direct attack on the continuation of the population. UN experts further reported systematic destruction of women's healthcare facilities and the use of sexual violence as a war strategy, constituting genocidal acts. In parallel, Israel has targeted Gaza's educational, cultural, and religious institutions, further undermining the community's survival and cohesion. Schools, universities, and cultural centers have been deliberately destroyed, with more than 80% of schools and thousands of educators and students killed or displaced. Cultural and religious heritage sites, including mosques and cemeteries, have been razed without military necessity. The Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention highlighted the destruction of cemeteries as an act of erasure of historical presence, signaling intent to annihilate the Palestinian people. By January 2025, Israel had destroyed 815 mosques and 19 cemeteries. The deliberate targeting of healthcare, reproductive services, education, and cultural institutions demonstrates a systematic campaign to destroy the Palestinian population in Gaza physically, socially, and culturally. UN experts have condemned these acts as crimes against humanity and evidence of genocidal intent, emphasizing that the sustained destruction of essential life-sustaining infrastructure and cultural identity constitutes a multidimensional assault on the survival of the Palestinian people. Serious bodily and mental harm, and sexual violence in Gaza. The ongoing Israeli assault on Gaza has inflicted catastrophic bodily, psychological, and sexual harm on the Palestinian population, constituting a deliberate strategy of group destruction. Since the 7th of October 2023, over 160,000 Palestinians have been injured, with Gaza recording the highest per capita rate of child amputees worldwide. In addition, more than 990 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank during the same period. Israel has been accused of systematic mass detentions, extrajudicial threats, and acts of torture against Palestinians held without charges, including mutilation, arson, and sexual assault. By March 2024, medical records identified an estimated 17,000 children classified as wounded children, no surviving family, WCNSF, underscoring the unprecedented scale of trauma among the youngest members of society. Reports from August 2024 revealed instances of rape and sexual assault at the SDE Timon detention camp, demonstrating the use of sexualized violence as a weapon against the Palestinian people. The Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention has categorized these acts as evidence of sexualized violence during genocide, highlighting that sexual assault was employed strategically to degrade, terrorize, and destroy the social fabric of the group. As of August 2024, UN estimates indicate that the majority of Gaza's 2.2 million residents are confined to approximately 15 square miles, creating severe shortages of essential services, including clean water, and triggering widespread outbreaks of preventable diseases such as hepatitis C. Amnesty International has documented patterns of abuse within Israeli detention facilities, noting the systematic dehumanization, mental torture, and physical harm inflicted on Palestinians, practices that collectively signal genocidal intent. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry concluded that gender-based and sexual violence in Gaza was committed with the purpose of dominating, oppressing, and destroying the Palestinian people in whole or in part. By September 2025, more than 21,000 children had sustained permanent disabilities as a direct consequence of the genocide, reflecting the scale of the humanitarian catastrophe and the enduring impact on the physical and mental well-being of Gaza's population. This comprehensive pattern of bodily, psychological, and sexual harm underscores the deliberate targeting of Palestinians as part of a systematic campaign of annihilation. Academic and legal discourse on the Gaza genocide. The military campaign conducted by Israel in Gaza has become the focus of extensive scholarly and legal scrutiny, generating a growing consensus among genocide experts, human rights organizations, and governments that the actions constitute genocide. Surveys conducted among Middle East scholars in early 2025 indicate that 46% defined Israel's operations as genocide, while 36% characterized them as major war crimes akin to genocide. Only a minority viewed the actions as unjustified but not constituting major war crimes or as justified under the right to self-defense, reflecting the widespread recognition of the severity and systematic nature of the assaults. Israel and its supporters continue to reject these accusations, but the evidence presented in academic and legal forums increasingly frames Gaza as a site of deliberate, targeted destruction of a civilian population. In the field of genocide and Holocaust studies, leading scholars have debated the classification of Israel's conduct. While some, such as Norman J. W. Goder and Jeffrey Herf, dispute the genocide designation, others, including Raz Siegel and Shira Klein, have emphasized that the systematic targeting of infrastructure, food, water, and civilian populations aligns with internationally recognized criteria for genocide. The International Association of Genocide Scholars, IAGS, the largest global network of experts in the field, formally adopted a resolution in August 2025 affirming that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza, marking a significant milestone in academic recognition of the crisis. Legal and human rights experts have also weighed in decisively. On the 26th of January 2024, the International Court of Justice issued a preliminary ruling supporting claims that Israel must take all necessary measures to prevent acts of genocide, halt incitement, and allow the delivery of basic humanitarian services to Gaza. University-based legal analyses, including reports from Boston University, Cornell, Yale, and the University of Pretoria, concluded that Israel has committed genocidal acts. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch corroborated these findings, with Amnesty explicitly identifying Israel's conduct as genocide and HRW recognizing genocidal acts while noting ongoing questions regarding intent. Beyond legal determinations, other scholars and professional bodies have underscored cultural and structural dimensions of the genocide. The Middle East Studies Association condemned Israel's escalating violence as cultural genocide, while surveys of hundreds of Middle East specialists conducted by the Brookings Institution demonstrate a growing academic consensus that the military campaign constitutes genocide. Opposing claims, primarily from right-wing Israeli think tanks such as the Begin, Sadat Center for Strategic Studies, argue that allegations of genocide are based on flawed methodology and selective data. However, these reports have been widely criticized by genocide scholars, including Ivor Vukusic and Alex de Waal, for dismissing well-documented evidence, misrepresenting famine conditions, and relying on authors lacking expertise in genocide studies. Collectively, the academic and legal discourse affirms that Israel's conduct in Gaza meets the thresholds for both genocidal acts and intent, underscoring the urgent need for accountability under international law. Legal proceedings and accountability in the Gaza genocide. The legal ramifications of Israel's military campaign in Gaza have generated extensive international attention, encompassing proceedings before the International Court of Justice, ICJ, the International Criminal Court, ICC, and numerous national and transnational lawsuits. South Africa initiated proceedings at the ICJ under the Genocide Convention, accusing Israel of committing genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity against the Palestinian population. In its December 2023 application, South Africa argued that Israel's actions were genocidal in character, aiming to destroy a substantial part of the Palestinian national, racial, and ethnic group. The ICJ issued a preliminary ruling on the 26th of January 2024, recognizing the plausibility of these claims and ordering Israel to prevent acts of genocide, halt incitement, and allow the delivery of basic humanitarian services to Gaza. Subsequent requests by South Africa for further protective measures in light of mass starvation were met with ambiguous orders from the court, which Israel refused to implement, continuing its military operations despite international legal obligations. Israeli officials have rejected all allegations, framing the ICJ proceedings as politically motivated and defending mass civilian casualties as justified self-defense. Parallel to the ICJ proceedings, the ICC has pursued accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza. In May 2024, the ICC prosecutor requested arrest warrants against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant for their roles in the Gaza genocide, issuing the warrants in November 2024. While these charges did not explicitly include genocide, Amnesty International and other human rights organizations called on the ICC to urgently examine the commission of genocide by Israeli officials since the 7th of October 2023. Complaints have also been filed against Israeli political and media figures for incitement to genocide, highlighting the breadth of legal scrutiny facing Israel. National and transnational lawsuits have further sought to hold states accountable for complicity. In the United States, the Center for Constitutional Rights filed a suit against President Joe Biden and senior officials, arguing that U.S. support for Israel facilitated genocidal acts. Although dismissed on constitutional grounds, the ruling acknowledged the plausibility of genocide claims. In Germany, Palestinians filed criminal complaints against government leaders for aiding and abetting genocide, while Nicaragua initiated proceedings against Germany at the ICJ for its support of Israel. In Australia, legal action has been taken against federal leaders for facilitating genocide and war crimes through military aid and political backing. The responsibility of third states has emerged as a central question under international law. Under the Genocide Convention, all signatory states are obliged to prevent genocide and refrain from enabling or facilitating its commission. Scholars and international bodies have argued that inaction or active support by states such as the United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom constitutes complicity. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Palestine has stated that failure to comply with ICJ orders or to prevent atrocities may amount to legal responsibility for genocide. Humanitarian organizations, including Oxfam, have sought legal remedies against states supplying arms to Israel, asserting that such actions render them complicit in ongoing violations of international humanitarian law. UN officials, including Navi Pillay, have warned that continuing state support for Israel undermines international law and sets a dangerous precedent for impunity. Collectively, these legal proceedings underscore the global recognition of grave crimes in Gaza, highlighting both direct accountability for Israeli officials and broader obligations for states that support or fail to prevent acts of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. International complicity and state support in the Gaza genocide. The ongoing genocide in Gaza has exposed the extensive involvement and complicity of multiple states, regional actors, and private entities in facilitating and sustaining Israel's military operations, raising significant questions under international law regarding responsibility for potential genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The United States has been the largest supporter of Israel's military apparatus, providing approximately $22.76 billion in military aid and operational funding between the 7th of October 2023 and the 30th of September 2024, alongside supplying roughly 15% of Israel's military budget. The U.S. has consistently used its UN Security Council veto to block ceasefire resolutions, effectively providing diplomatic cover for Israeli operations. Both the Biden and Trump administrations have denied allegations of genocide, while Trump publicly proposed the forcible removal of Palestinians and the restructuring of Gaza for U.S.-controlled development. Despite official denials, an August 2025 opinion poll found that half of U.S. voters believe genocide is occurring, and a majority oppose further military assistance, reflecting growing domestic criticism of U.S. complicity. Prominent members of Congress, including Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, and others, have explicitly labeled Israel's actions as genocide and condemned U.S. involvement. The United Kingdom has faced scrutiny for its role in supplying Israel with weapons through export licenses. Human Rights Watch and international legal experts warned that continuing arms sales risked complicity in war crimes. Following legal and public pressure, Foreign Secretary David Lammy suspended approximately 30 arms export licenses in September 2024, although hundreds remained active. The Scottish government subsequently implemented policies to block funding for arms companies supplying countries implicated in potential genocides, including Israel, and supported parliamentary measures to boycott Israeli military suppliers. Legal actions by ULHAC and the Global Legal Action Network have further challenged the UK government's licensing decisions under the Genocide Convention. Germany has similarly faced accusations of complicity through arms support and political backing of Israel. Public discourse has been constrained by legal restrictions on labeling Israel's actions as genocide, and criminal complaints have been filed against senior politicians for enabling atrocities. Nicaragua's ICJ case against Germany in March 2024 highlights the international dimension of state accountability for complicity in genocide. The European Union, through its failure to suspend the EU-Israel Association Agreement and continued trade relations, has been criticized for providing a green light to Israeli actions, with human rights organizations warning of potential complicity. Egypt has been implicated for enforcing the blockade of Gaza and restricting access through the Rafah crossing, actions that have drawn formal complaints before the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. While Egypt has opposed Israeli plans for forced displacement, its enforcement of border restrictions has been legally and ethically contested. Italy has also faced scrutiny for supplying military support to Israel. In October 2025, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and senior officials were formally reported to the ICC for alleged complicity in genocide, reflecting growing legal and civil society challenges to European state involvement. Italy ranked as the third-largest supplier of weaponry to Israel as of May 2025. Private corporations and financial institutions have been similarly implicated. Arms manufacturers, including Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, RTX Corporation, and BAE Systems, have been identified as profiting from the Gaza genocide. The UN has highlighted the role of technology companies such as Alphabet, Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, and Palantir in facilitating Israeli surveillance and military operations, while financial institutions, including Allianz, Barclays, BlackRock, and BNP Paribas, underwrite Israel's military expenditures. Scholars, journalists, and human rights advocates have also criticized Western media outlets for propagating narratives that obscure accountability, thereby contributing to complicity through information control. Collectively, these findings illustrate that the Gaza genocide involves a complex web of state, corporate, and institutional actors whose actions, or inactions, may constitute complicity under international law. The legal, ethical, and humanitarian implications of this global involvement underscore the urgent need for accountability and adherence to the principles of the Genocide Convention and international humanitarian law. Political and cultural discourse on the Gaza genocide. The international response to Israel's military campaign in Gaza has been sharply divided, encompassing political, legal, and cultural spheres. Several Western governments, including the United States, United Kingdom, and Germany, have refused to categorically label Israel's actions as genocide, frequently citing the necessity of judicial determination. Belgium, Norway, and Canada have opted to defer judgment, awaiting rulings from the International Court of Justice, ICJ. In contrast, a broad coalition of states across the Islamic world, Africa, Latin America, and parts of Europe, such as Turkey, Malaysia, Egypt, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Spain, Ireland, and Slovenia, have formally recognized the campaign as genocide and lent support to South Africa's ICJ case against Israel. Regional and intergovernmental bodies, including the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the Arab League, and the African Union, have collectively endorsed this characterization, advocating for accountability measures, including the cessation of arms transfers. Non-governmental and intergovernmental organizations have played a critical role in documenting and publicly condemning the ongoing atrocities. Early warnings of genocidal risk were issued by Genocide Watch and the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention in mid-October 2023. Palestinian human rights organizations, such as Defense for Children International, Al-Haq, Al-Mezan, and the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, have filed lawsuits alleging genocide, while Israeli groups, including B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights, Israel, have issued detailed reports identifying systematic genocidal acts. Global human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the International Federation for Human Rights, and the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, have corroborated these findings, highlighting Israel's destruction of infrastructure, forced displacement, and systematic attacks on civilian populations. Médecins Sans Frontières has confirmed that Israeli actions in Gaza constitute genocide, and advocacy groups such as Jewish Voice for Peace have called for urgent international intervention to halt the killings. In September 2025, the UN Human Rights Council's Independent International Commission of Inquiry concluded that Israeli authorities and security forces have committed and continue to commit 4 of the 5 acts defined as genocide under the 1948 Genocide Convention, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to destroy the group, and imposing measures to prevent births. Cultural discourse surrounding the Gaza genocide has been equally significant. Public intellectuals, celebrities, athletes, cultural institutions, and global activists have drawn attention to the humanitarian catastrophe and the broader societal implications of framing the genocide as genocide. Millions of people worldwide have participated in protests explicitly calling for the recognition of genocide and demanding international intervention. British sociologist Martin Shore has characterized the Gaza genocide as the genocide that changed the world, emphasizing the scale of global mobilization while noting the heavy toll on Israel's international legitimacy. Israeli journalist Gideon Levi has highlighted the generational trauma inflicted on Gazans by massacres, bombardments, and systematic destruction. Scholars adopting Third World approaches to international law argue that the international community's failure to address the Gaza genocide has undermined global legal principles and exposed structural weaknesses in governance. José Manuel Barreto asserts that the genocide exposes the colonial foundations of the international legal order, situating Gaza within a historical continuum of tolerated genocides. Mark Levine emphasizes that Israeli actions have eroded respect for international law and weakened global norms against large-scale violence, while Andrei Nolkemper notes the exceptional rejection of international legal standards by the United States in the context of Gaza. Observers, including journalist Colin Jones, report that U.S. military legal advisors consider Gaza a test case for acceptable conduct in potential future genocide with peer powers, such as China. Together, the political, legal, and cultural discourse underscores the profound global ramifications of Israel's campaign in Gaza, highlighting the urgent need for accountability, adherence to international law, and recognition of the systematic atrocities committed against the Palestinian population.